It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed at Betty's diner. Frank had just settled into his usual booth when the ground seemed to shake with the rumble of motorcycle engines. The sound grew louder until 5 massive motorcycles pulled into the diner's parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The bell above the door chimed differently that day, not its usual gentle ring, but a harsh jangle as the door burst open. 5 men in black leather jackets strutted in, their heavy boots thumping against the diner's tile floor. The patches on their jackets identified them as the Steel Demons, and their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, called himself Rattler. Sally, the waitress, nearly dropped her coffee pot when they entered. The usual morning quiet of Betty's diner disappeared, replaced by loud laughter and the scraping of chairs as the bikers pushed 2 tables together near Frank's booth. Their leather jackets creaked as they sat down, and the smell of motorcycle exhaust and cigarettes filled the air. "Hey, Grandpa," Rattler called out to Frank, his voice rough and mocking. "This your personal dining room or something?" The other bikers laughed, their voices echoing off the diner's walls. Frank kept his eyes on his newspaper, his hand steady as he turned the page, though his jaw tightened slightly. The bikers ordered their breakfast loudly, demanding extra bacon and making comments about how slow the service was. Sally moved quickly between tables, trying to keep everyone happy, but her usual cheerful smile had been replaced by a worried look. When she reached Frank's table to refill his coffee, her hands were shaking slightly. "You okay, Sally?" Frank asked quietly, his voice steady and kind. "I'm fine, Frank," she whispered back, but they both knew things weren't fine. The peaceful morning atmosphere that Frank and the other regulars had enjoyed for years was gone. As the days went by, the bikers made Betty's diner their regular morning stop. They seemed to take special pleasure in disrupting Frank's routine. They would park their motorcycles right in front of his usual window, blocking his view of the street. Sometimes they would accidentally on purpose bump his table while walking past, making his coffee spill. Old Tom Baker stopped coming by Frank's table for their morning chats. The bikers' loud conversations made it impossible to talk. Mary Chen, the school principal, started getting her coffee to go instead of drinking it at the counter. The Thompson kids' parents wouldn't let them walk past the diner anymore, worried about the rough-looking men hanging around outside. One morning, Rattler decided to sit in Frank's booth before he arrived. When Frank walked in at his usual time of 7:30 a.m., he found his space occupied. The other customers watched nervously, wondering what would happen. Frank stood there for a moment, leaning on his cane, his face calm, but his eyes studying the situation. "Looking for something, old-timer?" Rattler asked, spreading his arms across the back of the booth. His fellow bikers snickered from their nearby tables. Frank simply nodded politely and moved to another booth, but everyone could see how much it bothered him to change his routine. Sally brought his usual order to his new spot, giving him an apologetic look. The bikers celebrated their small victory with loud high-fives and laughter. As Frank sat in the unfamiliar booth, memories of his military days flashed through his mind. He remembered facing much worse situations in Vietnam, dealing with real danger and real enemies. These bikers were bullies, nothing more, but their presence was changing more than just his morning routine. It was changing the whole atmosphere of the diner and the neighborhood. That morning, as Frank finished his breakfast and carefully folded his newspaper, he noticed something different about Rattler's exposed forearm, a military unit tattoo that caught his attention. For just a moment, Frank's eyes narrowed as he studied it, his military training kicking in as he memorized every detail. Something about that tattoo didn't seem quite right, but Frank kept this observation to himself as he paid his bill and walked out of the diner, already forming a plan in his mind. As weeks passed, the situation at Betty's diner grew worse. The Steel Demons didn't just occupy the diner anymore, they seemed to own it. Their motorcycles lined the entire front of the building, the loud engines scaring away many regular customers. The peaceful morning atmosphere that Frank had enjoyed for 10 years was completely gone. Rattler and his gang had developed a routine of their own, but theirs was designed to torment Frank. They would wait for him to approach the diner, then rev their engines just as he passed by, startling him. Though Frank never showed fear, his hand would grip his cane a little tighter each time they did this. Sally tried her best to protect Frank, but there wasn't much she could do. One morning, when she brought Frank his usual wheat toast and coffee, one of the bikers stuck out his foot. Sally tripped, sending hot coffee flying across Frank's clean white shirt. The bikers roared with laughter while Sally apologized repeatedly, close to tears. "It's just a shirt, Sally," Frank said quietly, dabbing at the stain with a napkin. His voice was calm, but his eyes held a sadness that went deeper than the ruined shirt. Sally noticed his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from anger he was trying hard to control. The incident with the coffee seemed to give the bikers new ideas. They started playing what they called games. They would drop things near Frank's feet, forcing him to navigate carefully with his cane. They would mimic his careful, measured walk when he wasn't looking, making other bikers laugh. But Frank never gave them the satisfaction of showing how much it bothered him. Betty, the diner's owner, finally tried to step in. She was a short woman in her 60s who had run the place for 30 years. One morning, she confronted Rattler about his group's behavior. "This is a respectable establishment," Betty said, her voice firm despite her obvious nervousness. "If you can't behave properly, you'll need to find somewhere else to eat." Rattler just smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. He stood up slowly, towering over Betty. "This is a public place," he said, "and we're paying customers. Unless you want to lose even more business, I suggest you mind your own." Betty looked around the diner. Many of her regular customers had stopped coming. The morning rush that once filled every table was now just a trickle of brave souls who hurried in for quick takeout orders. She couldn't afford to lose any more business, and Rattler knew it. Frank watched all this from his new usual spot, a small table in the corner where he could keep his back to the wall, another habit from his military days. He noticed how the bikers had slowly taken over not just the diner, but the spirit of the whole neighborhood. The friendly waves from Mrs. Rodriguez had stopped. The Thompson kids no longer walked by. Even old Tom Baker had started taking a different route to his hardware store. One morning, Frank overheard two of the younger bikers talking when they thought no one was listening. They were discussing Rattler's military stories, tales of heroic actions in combat that had earned him respect among the group. Frank listened carefully, his military training helping him catch details that others might miss. The stories didn't add up, the dates were wrong, the locations impossible, the units mixed up. The final straw came when Rattler decided to tell one of his war stories loudly, making sure Frank could hear. He described a battle that supposedly happened in Vietnam, but Frank knew it couldn't be true. The location Rattler mentioned hadn't seen combat during the dates he claimed to be there. That evening, as Frank sat in his quiet house looking at his old military photographs, he made a decision. The young soldier in those photos hadn't let bullies win then, and the old veteran he'd become wouldn't let them win now. He walked to his closet and pulled out a cardboard box he hadn't opened in years. Inside was his dress uniform, still perfectly pressed, his medals still shining. As he carefully laid out the uniform, Frank began forming a plan. He thought about Rattler's suspicious tattoo, the impossible war stories, and all the little details that didn't add up. It was time to put his military intelligence training to use one more time. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Frank walked toward Betty's diner, leaning on his cane, mentally preparing himself for another day of harassment from the steel demons. The autumn wind carried the sound of motorcycle engines, and Frank could already see the black leather jackets through the diner's windows. Today was different, though. Frank had spent the past week gathering information, writing down every detail of Rattler's war stories, and studying the unit tattoo he'd glimpsed on the biker's arm. His military training had taught him to observe and remember, skills that hadn't faded with age. As Frank approached the diner's entrance, Rattler deliberately blocked the door. "Password required today, old-timer," he sneered, his gang laughing behind him. Frank stood quietly, his blue eyes meeting Rattler's dark sunglasses without fear. "Excuse me," Frank said politely, just as he had every other time they blocked his path. But this time, Rattler didn't move. Instead, he reached out and knocked Frank's cane from his hand. The wooden cane clattered across the sidewalk, rolling to a stop near the curb. The diner went silent. Sally watched through the window, her hands covering her mouth. Betty reached for the phone, wondering if she should call the police. Even some of the younger bikers looked uncomfortable with this new level of bullying. Frank stood perfectly still, balancing carefully without his cane. His face showed no fear, no anger, just the calm determination of a man who had faced far worse in his life. This seemed to anger Rattler even more. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Rattler taunted, moving closer to Frank. "Lost your walking stick. Maybe if you beg nicely, I'll let one of my boys get it for you." Frank's eyes never left Rattler's face, but his mind was racing. In that moment, with the morning sun reflecting off Rattler's sunglasses, Frank could clearly see what he'd been looking for. The unit tattoo on Rattler's forearm was exposed completely. The tattoo showed the insignia of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, with dates claiming service in Vietnam. Frank had served with the 173rd, and now he was certain the dates on Rattler's tattoo were wrong. The unit hadn't been in the location he claimed during those dates. More importantly, the insignia details were slightly off, the kind of mistakes only someone who hadn't really served would make. "Your tattoo?" Frank said quietly, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "The 173rd Airborne Brigade. I served with them." For the first time, Rattler's confident smirk faltered. He quickly pulled down his sleeve, but the damage was done. Some of his own gang members were looking at their leader with questioning eyes. "You saying something about my service, old man?" Rattler growled, trying to regain control of the situation. He pushed Frank's shoulder, not hard enough to knock him over, but enough to make him sway without his cane. That push was witnessed by everyone in the diner. Sally gasped. Betty finally started dialing the police. But before anyone could react further, one of the younger bikers, a man with his own genuine military tattoos, walked over and picked up Frank's cane. "Here you go, sir," the young biker said, handing the cane back to Frank with respect in his voice. He'd served in Afghanistan and recognized the quiet dignity of a real veteran. This small act of kindness from one of his own gang members seemed to enrage Rattler even more. He grabbed the young biker's shoulder, spinning him around. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Frank took his cane and stood straighter, his military bearing evident to anyone who knew what to look for. The pieces were all in place now, the fake tattoo, the impossible war stories, and most importantly, the growing doubt in the eyes of Rattler's own gang members. "I think," Frank said clearly, his voice carrying the authority of his military years, "it's time we had a talk about your service record, Mr. Thompson. Or should I say, about your lack of one." The local library became Frank's new morning destination. Instead of his usual booth at Betty's diner, he now sat at a computer terminal, his cane propped against the desk as his fingers slowly but steadily typed on the keyboard. Miss Thompson, the elderly librarian who had known Frank for years, was surprised to see him there every morning, especially when he asked for help accessing military databases. "Research," was all Frank would say when asked about his sudden interest in computers. His military training had taught him the value of quiet investigation, and he put those skills to work now. Each morning, he dug deeper into Rattler's, or Mike Thompson's, supposed military history. Frank started with basic public records. Mike Thompson had claimed to serve with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970, but as Frank discovered, during those exact years, Mike Thompson had actually been working at a garage in Kansas City, hundreds of miles from any military base. The employment records were clear and undeniable. Using his own military connections, Frank made several important phone calls. His old friend Bill, now working at the Veterans Affairs Office in Washington, helped him access service records. "Frank," Bill had said over the phone, his voice serious, "there's no record of a Mike Thompson serving with the 173rd during those years. Not anywhere in Vietnam." The more Frank dug, the worse it got. He discovered that Rattler had been collecting veterans' benefits for years, using forged documents. He had built his entire reputation in the motorcycle club on lies about his military service. The real veterans in his gang had trusted him, believing his stories of combat bravery. One rainy morning, while Frank was printing documents at the library, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Joey, the young biker who had picked up his cane that day at the diner. Joey looked uncomfortable in the quiet library, his leather jacket creaking as he sat down next to Frank. "I served in Afghanistan," Joey said quietly, glancing at the military documents on Frank's screen. "2 tours. When I joined the Steel Demons, Rattler said he understood what I'd been through because he'd served too. Said that's why he took me under his wing." Frank nodded, understanding the betrayal Joey felt. "He's been stealing more than just stories," Frank explained, showing Joey the evidence of Rattler's fraudulent veterans' benefits claims. Joey's face darkened as he read the documents. "There are 5 other real veterans in our group," Joey revealed. They all respect Rattler because of his supposed service. He uses his war stories to keep us in line, says we don't respect the Brotherhood if we question him. Frank carefully organized all his evidence in a manila envelope. Employment records showing where Rattler really was during his claimed service years, documentation of his fraudulent benefits claims, and photographs of real 173rd Airborne Brigade insignias that proved the mistakes in Rattler's tattoo. But Frank's most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez, his neighbor who used to wave to him every morning, turned out to be a gold mine of information. Her late husband had served with the real 173rd Airborne Brigade. I still have all Robert's old photographs and documents, she told Frank one afternoon, bringing over a box of military memorabilia. He served exactly when this Rattler claims he did. I don't see Rattler in any of these unit photos. As Frank added the final pieces of evidence to his file, he knew he had everything he needed. The proof was overwhelming. Rattler had never served in Vietnam, had never been in the military at all. He was a fraud who had built his entire reputation on stolen valor, taking advantage of real veterans' respect for military service. Frank looked at his dress uniform, still hanging pressed and ready in his closet. Tomorrow would be the day. He had faced real enemies in Vietnam, fought in real battles, and earned his medals the hard way. Now it was time to confront a different kind of enemy, one who dishonored everything Frank and his fellow veterans had fought for. Before going to bed that night, Frank polished his medals one last time. Tomorrow morning, instead of his usual khakis and white shirt, he would wear his full-dress uniform to Betty's diner. It was time to show Rattler and everyone else what a real veteran looked like. The morning sun had barely risen when Frank stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his dress uniform with practiced precision. Each medal and ribbon told a story of real sacrifice and courage. His silver star, bronze star, and purple heart gleamed against the dark blue fabric. Despite his age, the uniform still fit perfectly, a testament to his disciplined lifestyle. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the usual time he would enter Betty's diner, Frank walked through the parking lot where the Steel Demon's motorcycles were already lined up. Today, he didn't use his cane. His back was straight, his steps measured and purposeful, just as they had been during his military service. The bell above the diner's door rang as Frank entered. The usual morning chatter stopped immediately. Everyone stared at the transformation before them. Gone was the quiet old man in khakis and a white shirt. In his place stood a decorated veteran, his uniform telling a story of honor and service that needed no words. Rattler and his gang sat at their usual tables, but even they fell silent. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows made Frank's medals shine, drawing all eyes to them. Sally, behind the counter, had tears in her eyes. Betty stood in the kitchen doorway, a proud smile on her face. "Good morning," Frank said clearly, his voice carrying the authority of his military years. He walked directly to Rattler's table, the manila envelope in his hands. Joey, the young Afghanistan veteran, sat among the bikers, but his eyes showed he knew what was coming. "Plain dress up, old man?" Rattler tried to sound tough, but his voice wavered slightly. Some of his gang members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, looking between their leader and the decorated veteran standing before them. "Mike Thompson," Frank said, using Rattler's real name. "I think it's time we talked about your military service." He opened the envelope and began laying documents on the table, or rather, your lack of it. The diner was so quiet you could hear the coffee machine dripping. Frank continued, his voice clear and steady. "While you claim to be serving with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vietnam, these employment records show you were actually working at Joe's Auto Repair in Kansas City." Rattler's face reddened. He started to stand, but Joey put a hand on his shoulder, keeping him in his seat. Other bikers leaned forward, looking at the documents Frank was laying out. "Your unit tattoo," Frank continued, pointing to Rattler's arm, "has 3 mistakes that any real member of the 173rd would notice immediately. Would you like me to point them out?" Frank then pulled out the photographs Mrs. Rodriguez had provided. "These are real photos of the 173rd during the exact time you claimed to serve. Funny how you don't appear in any of them." The other bikers were now standing, moving closer to see the evidence. Many of them wore their own genuine service tattoos, and their faces darkened as they understood the extent of Rattler's deception. "But worst of all," Frank said, pulling out the final document, You've been collecting veterans' benefits for years, stealing from the same government you falsely claimed to serve. That's not just dishonorable, it's criminal. Rattler suddenly pushed back his chair and stood up, his face red with anger and embarrassment. You don't know what you're talking about, old man, he shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Frank replied calmly, because I really did serve with the 173rd. This silver star, I earned it saving 3 of my men in the Dacta Valley. This Purple Heart? That's from taking a bullet while doing it. Every medal on this uniform tells a true story of service and sacrifice. The other bikers had moved away from Rattler, forming a circle around him and Frank. Joey stepped forward, his own service medals pinned to his leather jacket. One by one, other veterans in the gang did the same, silently declaring where they stood. You lied to us, Joey said to Rattler, his voice filled with disgust. We followed you because we thought you were one of us, but you're nothing but a fraud. Frank stood quietly, his mission accomplished. The truth was out, and now it was up to the real veterans in the Steel Demons to decide what to do with their fallen leader. The next few minutes in Betty's diner unfolded like scenes from a movie. Rattler stood alone, his tough guy image crumbling as his own gang members turned their backs on him. The fake military tattoo on his arm, once a source of pride, now seemed to burn with shame. Joey stepped forward, removing his leather vest with the Steel Demons patch. I didn't join this club to follow a liar, he announced, his voice carrying across the silent diner. My grandfather died in Vietnam, my brother lost his leg in Iraq, and you've been mocking their sacrifices with your fake stories. One by one, other veterans in the gang removed their vests too. They placed them on the table in front of Rattler, each one sharing their own genuine service stories. Mike, the wrench Anderson, had served in Desert Storm. Tony Martinez had done 3 tours in Afghanistan. Bill Eagle Thompson had been a Marine in Iraq. 8 years in the Marines, Bill said, looking at Rattler with disgust. Lost 2 of my best friends over there, and you've been using our brotherhood to build yourself up. To collect benefits you never earned. Frank stood quietly, watching as real veterans confronted the man who had stolen their stories and trust. Sally brought him his usual coffee and toast, placing them at his old booth, the one Rattler had taken from him weeks ago. The other customers in the diner watched in respectful silence. The police have been called, Betty announced from behind the counter. The VA office is very interested in talking to Mr. Thompson about those fraudulent benefits claims. Rattler's face had lost all color. His tough biker appearance seemed to shrink as he realized how completely his lies had been exposed. He looked around desperately, but found no allies among his former gang members. You don't understand, Rattler tried to explain, his voice shaking. I wanted to serve, but they wouldn't take me. I just wanted to be part of something. Being part of something is earned, Frank said quietly, speaking for the first time since presenting his evidence. Those medals on my uniform, each one represents brothers lost, sacrifices made, moments of real courage. You can't buy that respect with lies. The sound of police sirens grew closer. 2 patrol cars pulled into the diner's parking lot, their lights flashing. Through the window, everyone could see Mrs. Rodriguez talking to the officers, pointing toward the diner. As the police entered, Joey approached Frank with respect in his eyes. Sir, he said, standing at attention like he was back in the service, I want to apologize. We should have seen through his lies. Should have shown you the respect you deserved from the beginning. Frank shook his head. No apologies needed, son. You served your country with honor. That's all that matters. The police led Rattler away in handcuffs, his head down, avoiding everyone's eyes. The other bikers watched silently as their former leader was placed in the patrol car. The charges were serious: fraud against the government, theft of benefits, and stolen valor. Betty walked over to Frank's booth, tears in her eyes. Your breakfast is on the house from now on, Frank, she said softly. What you did today, you gave us all our diner back. The morning sun streamed through the window of Frank's booth, making his medals shine once again. Sally brought fresh coffee for everyone, and slowly, the real veterans of the Steel Demons gathered around Frank's table. Tell us about the 173rd, Joey asked, pulling up a chair. If you don't mind sharing, sir. We'd like to hear some real war stories for a change. Frank looked around at the younger veterans. seeing in their eyes the same brotherhood he'd known in Vietnam. These men had served in different wars, different decades, but they shared the same courage and honor he remembered from his own service. "Well," Frank began, a small smile crossing his face, "it all started in 1968 in a place called Dak Tu." The other veterans leaned in, recognizing the name of the famous battle, ready to hear a true story of service and sacrifice from a real American hero. 1 month after Rattler's arrest, Betty's diner looked very different on Monday mornings. The line of motorcycles outside had changed. They were now carefully parked, leaving the handicapped spaces clear. The Steel Demons had transformed, with Joey elected as their new leader. They'd even changed their name to the Veterans Guard, honoring their members' true military service. Frank still arrived at exactly 7:30 a.m., but now he was greeted by respectful nods from the bikers. His usual booth had become the center of what the regulars called the Veterans Circle. Every Monday morning, veterans from different eras would gather there, sharing stories and supporting each other. "Tell them about the helicopter rescue, Frank," Joey would often say, sitting with his coffee. The younger veterans loved hearing Frank's stories, not just about battles, but about the brotherhood and sacrifice he'd experienced. Unlike Rattler's fake tales, Frank's stories carried the weight of truth, often ending with lessons learned or memories of fallen friends. The Thompson kids were back, walking past the diner on their way to school. Now, instead of being scared, they would wave at the bikers, who had become protective figures in the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez brought homemade cookies every Monday, saying they reminded her of the ones she used to send to her husband in Vietnam. Sally had created a special wall in the diner, which she called the Wall of Honor. It displayed photographs of local veterans, including Frank in his younger days, Joey in Afghanistan, and others from different wars. Each photo told a real story of service, and the wall became a proud feature of Betty's diner. The Veterans Guard did more than just meet for coffee. Under Joey's leadership, they started helping other veterans in the community. They organized rides to the VA hospital, helped elderly veterans with home repairs, and mentored young soldiers returning from deployment. Frank became their unofficial advisor, his wisdom guiding their efforts to serve their fellow veterans. "You know what the real difference is now," Betty said one morning, refilling Frank's coffee cup. "These boys aren't trying to prove anything. They're just being who they really are, heroes who served their country." The diner had become a place where veterans could find help when they needed it. Sometimes, a quiet veteran would sit alone, dealing with memories of war. The others would notice and gradually include him in their conversations, sharing their own experiences and understanding. This was the real brotherhood that Rattler had tried to fake, one built on shared experiences and genuine support. Old Tom Baker returned to his morning visits, now joining the veterans' conversations with stories about his brother who had served in Korea. Mary Chen, the school principal, arranged for Frank and some of the Veterans Guard to speak at school assemblies about real military service and honor. One Monday morning, Frank walked into the diner wearing his dress uniform again. This time, it wasn't for confrontation but celebration. The Veterans Guard was organizing their first annual breakfast to raise money for the local VA hospital. The diner was packed with veterans from World War II to Afghanistan, their families, and community members who came to show support. "You changed more than just our gang, sir," Joey told Frank during the breakfast. "You showed us what real leadership looks like. Not bullying or telling fake stories, but serving others and standing up for what's right." Frank looked around the crowded diner. Where once there had been intimidation and fear, now there was respect and friendship. The medals on his uniform caught the morning sun, but it was the warmth in his eyes that really shone as he watched young and old veterans talking together, sharing their stories, helping each other heal. Sometimes, Frank said to Joey, "The bravest thing we can do is tell the truth. Everything else, the brotherhood, the respect, the honor, it all follows from that." As Frank sat in his booth that morning, surrounded by real heroes and true stories of service, he realized that his peaceful morning routine hadn't just been restored. It had been transformed into something better. Betty's Diner had become more than just a breakfast spot. It was now a place where the true spirit of military service lived on, where veterans of all ages found the support and understanding they deserved.